In the sweltering summer of 1787, 55 white men gathered in Philadelphia's Independence Hall, a city still echoing the revolutionary spirit of 1776, and they were visionaries, soldiers, statesmen, the same leaders who had in years prior defied British rule. Though we only did so with the help of the French, I want to point that out, more on that later. Now they faced an even greater challenge. How do we build a government strong enough to survive, but restrained enough to prevent tyranny? The result was the United States Constitution, which was a radical experiment in democracy of its time. It would shape the future of the nation and of the world, but this historic document was not forged without conflict, compromise, and intense debate, and so much alcohol. In today's climate, we see a direct affront to the Constitution and the rights that it protects. But in the flurry of the chaos and slews of executive orders, we might be asking, well, is this particular order a violation of the Constitution? What is the limit of the power of the president? The Marquette poll showed that 57% of Americans have never read the Constitution, and many of us who have or were taught it haven't really since we were in grade school. As the regime seeks to upend the system of government we have enjoyed, especially in light of the head archivist being fired and the deputy archivist resigning, who protect our documents and protect our history, mere weeks after the Constitution disappeared off the White House website, it's more critical now than ever that we know exactly what our rights are and exactly what the limitations of government are. I would highly recommend making sure you have a physical copy of the Constitution at home. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of the Constitution, as well as some lesser-known history surrounding the government and the one document that puts a leash on our ever power-hungry institutions. Hopefully today I can teach you about the Constitution, give you some fun stories. You might be surprised again how much of a role alcohol played in this. Arms, actions, amendments on today's episode of Flipping Tables. Hello from Wellington, New Zealand. I have been on the dream vacation of a lifetime, seeing all my favorite Lord of the Rings filming locations, visiting Weta Workshop, lots of hiking, lots of sun. It's been wonderful, but I'm not going to miss any of my podcast episodes. I wanted to extend a huge thank you to my Patreon members who have been continuously voting on content, supporting me through this journey, as well as kind of giving me the basis of my platform to run for office. I'm meeting with some organizations in Tennessee when I get back about starting my own campaigns, running for local elections. Very, very excited about that. So please consider becoming a Patreon member. It'll be in the show notes. It's $1 a week, and you get early episodes of the podcast. You get to vote on topics as well as kind of exclusive content written there. I do copy some of my Instagram content over there, kind of as a fail-safe against Meta. But it's primarily for extra episodes of the podcast, voting power, as well as deep dives from me. And on that note, next week I'm doing 2 episodes celebrating Black History Month. Google may kiss the ring, I will not. And I spent a lot of time debating on what I wanted to cover. And the episode that's going to be released for everyone is going to be a celebration of some lesser known African-American historical stories that you may not know. I debated on doing topics of slavery and civil rights, which I'm going to cover extensively throughout this podcast as we discuss fundamentalism and white supremacy. And I wanted to take an episode and just celebrate greatness. And I'll tease a little bit of that, one of them being a man you may have never heard of named Robert Smalls, who was an enslaved man who commandeered a Confederate ship, fought for his own freedom, and later became a congressman. I wanted to take a time to just celebrate these stories that we don't hear about in the whitewashed version of American history that we often hear about, because we are going to cover so often and so frequently in this podcast the darker side of those histories. But for the bonus episode coming out on Friday for Patreon users, we are going to cover one of the most violent conflicts of the civil rights movement that's very rarely talked about. So if you want to hear that episode that's coming out on Friday, sign up for my Patreon. So the regular episode will come out Wednesday and the bonus episode will come out on Friday. Also, a huge thank you To everyone who supported my GoFundMe this past week, I mentioned in a video that I have to replace my computer. I've been recording my podcast on a MacBook Air, which simply does not have the processing power to handle the recordings. It crashes multiple times an episode. It takes me about 5 hours to record an episode because I have to record it in pieces. And I had mentioned needing to upgrade. A few people reached out to me saying, hey, we'd love to support you getting an updated computer. And within, I think, a day and a half, maybe 2 days, I was hiking a lot, so I didn't have service. By the time I got back, there was enough money for me to buy a new computer, which is absolutely incredible and going to make my life significantly easier. So I deeply appreciate that. So I have a few more episodes that will occur on my little baby MacBook Air, but then I'll be able to sit down and record these in one swoop without it taking quite so much time. So today what we're going to talk about is the U.S. Constitution. I'm going to give a brief overview of what it covers, the restrictions that it puts in place. I'm not going to read it to you. That would be so boring and just put you to sleep. But I think that it's important and foundational that we understand exactly what the Constitution says so that we understand if a law or an executive order is in fact unconstitutional. After the American Revolution, which lasted from April 19th, 1775 to September 3rd, 1783, the newly freed states were bound together under what was called the Articles of Confederation, a government that was in theory designed to protect liberty, but in practice it left the country very weak, divided, and on the brink of collapse. This is important to discuss in our current environment because the Heritage Foundation keeps pushing this idea of decentralized government and less regulation as if that is a good thing. There's a few problems with that. One, the Articles of Confederation were just that. They followed these parameters. No strong central government. Each state acted as its own independent country. There was no power to tax. Congress had to beg states for money. There was no national military, and the government couldn't even stop uprisings. So this left a country that was extremely fragile. It really didn't qualify as much of a country at all. And in more recent history, Ronald Reagan rode the magic carpet of the welfare queen all the way into the White House. In his commentary, he said, quote, "She's from the Chicago South Side," which was a dog whistle that she was black. And this was the preferred route so that they can say, oh, I didn't say she was black, but they'll hint at it. When those listening knew exactly what he meant. He said, and this is a direct quote, "She has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and is collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. And she is collecting social security on her cards. She's got Medicaid, she's getting food stamps, and she is collecting welfare under each of her names. This is not at all representative of the typical welfare recipient, but someone who's more akin to an identity thief that we would battle today." But that didn't matter. It played into the Christian fundamentalist and white nationalist ideology that regulation and government involvement is stripping hardworking whites of their income and giving it to, quote, lazy welfare queens, most often assumed to be black. But here's the reality, is that government regulation was limiting wealth disparity, protecting workers and the middle class. It was the reason that you could unionize and demand better working conditions, that you have recourse if an employer refuses to pay you, that you did have to be paid for overtime, and it illegalized things like child labor. Not only do those direct protections to the workforce apply, but we now have a measure of how wealth was distributed. So again, the Heritage Foundation is pushing for decentralization, deregulation. But in the wake of Reagan's deregulation policies, between those deregulation policies and tax cuts from 1981 when Reagan took office to 2021 when Joe Biden did, $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Because that is what happens when you deregulate. Regulation and taxing the wealthy and corporations protects the working and middle classes from wealth disparity and unfair working environments. There is now no state within the U.S. where a 40-hour minimum wage job can get you an apartment. If we had learned from the Articles of Confederation, could have been avoided, but here we are. Like DEI programs that benefited by far white women, white conservatives, especially Christians, thought that DEI and government regulations benefited only non-whites and women, so they've been happy to see those programs get the axe, and it will hit home later. For example, Ashley Hall, a prestigious, essentially all-white girls' school in Charleston, South Carolina, hosted up until now a yearly Women in Engineering conference where members of the armed forces and those who work in government would come to the school and host a half-day series encouraging upper-class students to pursue the fields of STEM and engineering. This year, it was canceled because due to Trump's anti-DEI policy, the federal employees cannot come to a school for an all-girls event. Enter the shocked Southern white women. Also, any research that is federally funded cannot contain the words gender, woman, female. It can contain male or man, of course. Also, please know that women's sports that they scream about protecting are also DEI programs. Women's scholarships are also a DEI program. Anyways, back to the Articles of Confederation. They left a weak, unstable, divided government and ran the risk of long-term wealth disparity and a lack of protection for American citizens. George Washington grimly observed, "We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion. The United States of America would not last long without a stronger form of government." So on May 25th, 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island, refused to participate, and they were so not on board with it that they actually threw a festival while the Constitution Convention was meeting. But 12 of the 13 states sent delegates to Philadelphia for what was supposed to be a meeting to revise the Articles of the Confederation. However, it became clear very quickly they needed an entirely new document. James Madison, who's called the father of the Constitution, said the Articles of Confederation are so defective that they must be abolished altogether. And behind closed doors and under strict secrecy, the delegates began drafting an entirely new government. The closed-door policy actually almost made the Constitutional Convention shut down because it was so hot and humid in Philadelphia that summer. Obviously, there's no air conditioning at this time, and they had a bare minimum primitive bathroom situation that made men much more likely to fight with each other. So the heat and the lack of proper bathrooms almost caused the convention to come to a screeching halt. So overseeing the convention as the functioning president was George Washington. James Madison, the brilliant political thinker, crafted most of the Constitution's framework, and he insisted if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And as a reminder, he also said that the purpose of the separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries. The man who is the foundational source of the Constitution was adamant about the separation of church and state. Another key figure was Alexander Hamilton. He advocated for a strong national government, believing that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty. He's also responsible for our central banking system. Benjamin Franklin, an elder statesman at this time, who came in and reminded the delegates of the gravity of their mission by saying, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Benjamin Franklin, in his old age attending the convention, often had to be carried into the convention hall and at times could not read his own speeches. They had to be read for him. But he still came. So there were so many great debates in the beginning of building the Constitution. The delegates were deeply divided on certain key issues. One was the large states versus small states. Large states wanted representation to be based on population, obviously. Small states wanted equal representation. That is how we came by what is called the bicameral or two-house legislature. The House of Representatives is based on population. The Senate, every single state, regardless of population, gets 2 votes. This was called the Great Compromise. Then there was the question of slavery. Of course, southern states wanted slaves to be counted for representation. It gave them more power in Congress. Northern states opposed this because slaves by law at that time were property, not citizens. So the compromise at the time was to consider enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. This would be counted for both taxation and representation. And though this preserved national unity, this compromise not only allowed for slavery to persist, but would eventually lead to the Civil War decades later. Then there was the matter of who's the leader? Is it a king or a servant? What does the presidency mean? Some wanted a strong executive figure. Others feared that that would lead to a new form of monarchy. The solution was a single president who would be referred to as Mr. President. That was George Washington's choice, would be elected by an electoral college rather than the direct popular vote and would serve a 4-year term. The Electoral College is the system used to elect both the President and the Vice President of the United States, and the Electoral College has been a matter of huge debate in recent years, many people believing that it should be a popular vote only. But let's talk about why the Electoral College was provided in the first place. So it was a compromise between the direct popular vote, again favored by larger states, and congressional selection of the president, favored by smaller states. Again, they would have had more representation. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton feared both mob rule, which would have been just a popular vote, and excessive legislative power, which would have been the president gets chosen by Congress. So they designated the Electoral College system to blend the two together. Each state gets electoral votes equal to its number of senators, which is 2, and representatives, which is directed by population. The total number of electorals today is 538. It requires 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. In recent modern controversies, we see the Bush versus Gore election in 2000, which was decided by just 537 votes in Florida, where the Supreme Court stopped a recount. And in 2016 election, we saw Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, but Donald Trump won the presidency through the Electoral College. Now, part of the issue of the Electoral College is that the majority doesn't necessarily get the vote. The majority of the nation doesn't necessarily get to direct the direction of the nation. And 5 times in U.S. history, a candidate has won the presidency without winning the popular vote, and that's 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016. This also creates a unique situation in the battleground states or the swing states, which gives them much more power by comparison than states that traditionally vote red or vote blue. And it's a winner-take-all system. Typically, the Electoral College, whoever gets the majority of votes, they give all of their electoral votes to that person, which really inhibits third-party candidates and means that millions of votes in strongly partisan states really don't have an impact. On September 17, 1787, the delegates signed the final draft of the United States Constitution. It was actually a fun little tidbit of trivia here. It was reworked by a founding father named Governor Morris, who, yes, his name was Governor, who had a wooden leg that he claimed he lost in a carriage accident fleeing a jealous husband. It's more likely that he just lost it in a carriage accident, but fleeing a romantic tryst kind of sounds better. But Governor Morris is the reason that the Constitution is much more readable. He wrote the entire preamble, including the famous words, "We the people." The Constitution then had to be approved by at least 9 states to become law. So there was the Federalists and there was the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, which was Hamilton, Madison, supported the Constitution, arguing in the Federalist Papers that a strong central government was necessary. The Anti-Federalists, which included Patrick Henry and George Mason, feared that the new government would be too powerful and would violate individual rights. Patrick Henry warned the Constitution is a beast that will consume our liberties. This is where the Bill of Rights come in. To secure ratification, the Federalists agreed to add a Bill of Rights to ensure protections like freedom of speech and religion, the right to bear arms, protection from unlawful searches, fair trials, and legal protections. With this promise, the Constitution was officially ratified on June 21st of 1788, when New Hampshire would become the 9th state to approve it. The Constitution was a document that was meant to evolve. As Thomas Jefferson wisely noted, the Constitution belongs to the living and not to the dead, and he recommended it be revised and updated every 20 years based on life expectancy at the time, so that the Constitution would reflect the generation it currently governed. So, for instance, the right to bear arms, which is obviously a big one that's brought up constantly in debates. This was written by the Founding Fathers with muskets in mind. The most proficient soldier with a single ball musket that has to be tamped down with gunpowder before you load it could get off 3 to 4 shots per minute. By contrast, the AR-15 shoots 45 rounds per minute. If it's outfitted with a bump stock, it can shoot 400 rounds per minute or more. That law was not written with our modern technology in mind. That would have been unfathomable to them, and they probably would have been concerned about the average citizen having that. And I say this as a gun owner, simply the perspective of, hey, we need to reevaluate these laws so that they reflect our current system. Our forefathers didn't know anything about automatic or semi-automatic weapons or tanks or helicopters. They didn't have any of that. They had single shot, bayonet outfitted muskets. That was it, which is why the Constitution is designed to evolve as we the people evolve. Now, it's important to know here that the Founding Fathers drank a lot. They drank before meetings, after meetings, as they were debating things with each other, as they were discussing business. But after finishing the Constitution, the delegates celebrated with a massive drinking party at a local tavern. Records show they consumed 54 bottles of Madeira wine, 60 bottles of claret, 8 bottles of whiskey, 22 bottles of port, 12 bottles of beer, and 7 large bowls of spiked punch, which means that they were wasted while finalizing the government. Yay. So let's dive into what the Constitution actually says. The Constitution was originally 5 articles and the Bill of Rights and has amendments added over the course of our history. In Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, it establishes the legislative branch, known as Congress, outlines its powers, structure, and functions, and it's divided into 10 sections. Section 1 is legislative power. This establishes all the legislative power that are vested into Congress's 2 chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Again, this is a bicameral legislature that was a compromise between the large and small states. Section 2 covers the House of Representatives. It establishes what the House of Representatives are and what the requirements are and the rules. Clause 1 of Section 2, representatives are elected every 2 years by the people of the states they represent. Clause 2 is their qualifications. They have to be at least 25 years old, have been a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and live in the state they represent. Clause 3 is apportionment and census. Seats in the House is represented by the population of those states, and that census is taken every 10 years. The original rule counted enslaved person as 3/5 of a person, which we talked about earlier. This will later be eliminated by the 14th Amendment. Clause 4 is how to deal with vacancies. If a seat becomes vacant, the state's governor calls what's called a special election, and there are some important special elections coming up soon that we can use to vote Democrats back in to overthrow the majority in the House of Representatives. Clause 5 is the House Speaker and impeachment power. The House elects their own Speaker, who is the leader of the House, and the House has sole power of impeachment, charging officials but not convicting them. So the only part of Congress who can bring forth articles of impeachment is the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 3 covers the Senate. Clause 1 is the composition and elections of senators. Each state gets 2 senators. Senators serve a 6-year term, and originally state legislators chose the senators, but the 17th Amendment in 1913 changed that to a direct election by the people. Clause 2 is the Senate's rotating terms. The Senate is divided into 3 classes so that 1/3 is up for election every 2 years, so that you're not having the entire Senate possibly replaced in one election cycle. Clause 3 is the qualifications. A senator must be at least 30 years old, have been a U.S. citizen for at least 9 years, live in the state that they represent. Clause 4 is the vice president as Senate leader. This is one of the few roles of the vice president. He's the president of the Senate, but only votes to break ties. Clause 5 is the president pro tempore. If the vice president is absent, the Senate elects a president pro tempore to preside over the Senate. Clause 6 is impeachment trials. So while the House of Representatives can file articles of impeachment, the Senate conducts impeachment trials. Conviction requires a 2/3 vote. And if the president is on trial, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the trial. Clause 7 is the impeachment penalties. A convicted official can be removed from office and banned from holding future office, but still may face criminal charges separately. The Senate is not responsible for that. In Article 1, Section 4, it covers congressional elections. States control the how and the when elections are held. Congress can alter election laws except for Senate selection rules. And Congress must meet at least once a year. Originally, this was December 1st, but the 20th Amendment changed that to January 3rd. Section 5 of Article 1 talks about the rules and conduct of Congress. Each chamber separately determines its own rules. A majority or a quorum must be present to do business. Members can be punished or expelled for bad conduct with a 2/3 vote, and each member each chamber keeps a journal of proceedings, which is known as the congressional record. Section 6 is compensation and privileges. Congress are paid out of the U.S. Treasury, and they are immune from arrest except for treason, felony, or breach of peace while performing official duties, which is fascinating considering the history of criminal activity in the government the past few years. Members cannot hold any other government jobs while serving in Congress, and ironically, it's the only job I know of where you get to vote for your own salary. Granted, that salary doesn't take hold until the next election cycle, but I'm sure that it's benefited many people who have voted for a raise. But contrary to social media rumor, they do not get free healthcare, much less for life. They get great employer-based insurance and have benefits and pensions similar to other federal employees. Section 7 of Article 1 talks about how a bill becomes a law. In the first clause, it talks about revenue bills, that all tax bills must start in the House, which means that taxation starts with the representatives that are closest to the people and the representatives that represent most of the population. Clause 2 talks about how bills become law. So a bill must pass the House, it passes the Senate, the president can sign or veto it, Congress can override a veto with 2/3 vote. Again, we're balancing power so nobody can take the helm completely. If a president does nothing about a bill for 10 days, the bill becomes law. If the Congress adjourns before 10 days and the president has not signed it, it's called a pocket veto, which means the bill dies. Clause 3 talks about resolutions. So joint resolutions, which function like laws and are approved in equal measure by the House and the Senate, must still be signed by the president. Again, the Congress can't just carte blanche initiate a law, and neither can the president. In Section 8 of Article 1 talks about the powers of Congress. These powers include they can collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, trade between states, foreign nations, and tribes. They can establish naturalization, citizenship rules, coin money and regulate currency, punish counterfeiting, establish post offices, grant patents and copyrights, create courts below the Supreme Court, punish piracy, declare war, raise and fund the military, call and regulate the militia or the National Guard, make laws for Washington, D.C., and make all laws necessary and proper, which is called the Elastic Clause. Section 9 is the limits of Congress. Again, so this is the original Constitution. We will go over the amendments later. Originally, there was no banning of the slave trade, no suspending of habeas corpus except in emergencies, no bills of attainder, which means punishing someone without a fair trial, no ex post facto laws, punishing actions retroactively, no direct taxes, no favoring states in trade laws, no spending money without congressional approval, and no titles of nobility. This was to ensure democracy. Section 10 is the limits on the states. So while the states have rights, they also have limitations. The states cannot enter treaties or coin money, pass ex post facto laws, again, punishing people retroactively, or bills of attainder. You cannot punish someone without a trial. They can't tax imports or exports without Congress's approval, and they cannot keep an army or a navy during peacetime or declare war. This would be obviously broken down during the Civil War. Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution covers the executive branch. So here we're talking about the president, the vice president, and executive agencies. It defines the power, their responsibilities, but again, limitations. To the best of their ability, the founding fathers tried to put in guardrails and fail-safes so that no one branch of government would have too much power. Section 1 is about the president and the vice president. Clause 1 establishes that the executive power is vested in the president and that the president serves a 4-year term, as does the vice president. Clause 2 established the Electoral College that we discussed before. Each state appoints electors equal to the total number of senators and representatives, and it's the state legislatures that decide how these electors are chosen. The original system described in Clause 3 required electors to vote for 2 candidates, and the winner would become the president and the runner-up would become the vice president. So what that would mean, like if we took last year's election, when the Constitution was originally passed, again, assuming all things being equal, Trump would have become the president and Harris would have been the vice president again, which was how they did it at first. So the opposing candidates would each be voted on. Whoever won the most votes would be president. The other person would be vice president, which in theory is kind of great because you have two opposing parties both represented in the executive branch. However, this was changed later, which I will talk about. Clause 4, election timing. It's Congress that sets the national election date, which is, as we know, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Electoral votes are counted by Congress. Clause 5 is the qualifications for a president. A person must meet these 3 requirements. You have to be a natural-born citizen and at least 35 years old, a resident of the U.S. for at least 14 years. Clause 6 talks about presidential succession. So if the president dies or he resigns or is removed, the vice president then becomes president. This is one of the other very few roles designated to the vice president. Congress is now the one who decides the line of succession if both the president and the vice president are unable to serve. This now goes to the Speaker of the House is the third in line. So that would be Mike Johnson in our case, which is none of these are great options. It was the 25th Amendment in 1967 that clarifies the process for filling a vice presidential vacancy, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Clause 7 is the presidential salary. The salary is fixed and it cannot be changed during their term. The president cannot receive any other government salary or emolument. The oath of office covered in Clause 8 was written by the Founding Fathers, and each president is to say, "I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." And most presidents have chosen, starting with George Washington, to swear on the Bible, but that has not been exclusive. John Quincy Adams used a book of law, and Teddy Roosevelt did not use any book when he was sworn in. They are also typically sworn in by the Chief Justice, but not always. When Lyndon Johnson was sworn in after the death of John F. Kennedy, he was sworn in by Sarah T. Hughes, who was a district judge in Texas. Calvin Coolidge was sworn in by his father, who was a notary public and a justice of the peace, after the death of Warren G. Harding. So Article 2, Section 2 talks about what powers the presidents have. He is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, and the president has the power to grant pardons for federal crimes except in cases of impeachment. Clause 2 is treaty-making and appointment power. The president can negotiate treaties, but they must be approved by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. The president appoints ambassadors, Supreme Court justices, and other federal officers, but these appointments require Senate confirmation. So we've been watching all these confirmation hearings. I still believe that Linda McMahon is still doing hers, which is, again, just a nightmare. I can't believe that she's even in the conversation. But that's, again, to limit the powers. The president can't just decide, oh, I'm filling all these roles. Congress is supposed to have the ability to say, no, you're not putting that person there. When Trump made the sweeping firing of the inspector generals, he illegally violated the protections of their dismissal, which requires a written, detailed notice of removal and why, which is to be presented to Congress, because Congress makes that call. But this is not Trump's idea, though. One of Ronald Reagan's first official acts on January 20th of 1981 was to remove all 15 inspector generals from Congress. Bit more integrity than Congress protested and pushed back. But here's the thing. If you're truly interested in getting rid of waste and fraud in the government, that is the inspector general's job. That is what they do. They investigate fraud, they investigate dishonesty, they investigate waste, they investigate audits. You would empower them, as Pete Buttigieg put it, instead of get rid of them. If you want to increase waste and fraud, presumably to line your own pockets, you would disenfranchise them. The only exception to these appointment restrictions happens in Clause 3. So if Senate is in a recess and the president has to fill an appointment, he can temporarily appoint someone without Senate's approval, but those appointments expire at the end of the Senate's next session. In Section 3, so we're in Article 2, Section 3, it talks about the State of the Union address. The president must inform Congress about the state of the country and recommend necessary laws. This has evolved into our annual State of the Union address. Clause 2 talks about special sessions of Congress, that the president can call a special session of Congress if necessary, can also adjourn Congress in cases of disputes over adjournment. Clause 3 is about receiving ambassadors. The president receives foreign ambassadors and diplomats, meaning they officially recognize foreign governments. Clause 4 talks about executing laws. The president must ensure that laws passed by Congress are faithfully executed. That's why he is the leader of the executive branch. This gives the president pretty broad enforcement powers over the federal government, but the laws themselves are written and passed by Congress. In Section 4, this is impeachment and removal from office. The president, vice president, and federal officials can be impeached and removed for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. So it's a little bit vague there. Impeachment process starts with the House of Representatives. They bring and present impeachment charges. A majority vote is required. The Senate holds the trial. It's presided over by the Chief Justice if it's the president, and a 2/3 Senate vote is required to convict and remove a president. Some notable impeachments. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868. He was the president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The main reason for his impeachment was his violation of what's called the Tenure Office Act. This law, which was later found unconstitutional, required the president to get Senate approval before removing certain government officials. He fired someone, and Senate got so mad about it that they impeached him. He was acquitted, however, by 1 vote. My, how we have fallen. This guy literally fired someone, and they were like, nope, can't do that. Bill Clinton's impeachment in 1998. We all know about Monica Lewinsky, and he was acquitted. Donald Trump in both 2019 and 2021, acquitted both times. Nixon would have faced impeachment due to the Watergate scandal, but he proactively resigned and is the only president in U.S. history to have resigned. There has been no U.S. president that has ever been removed from office through impeachment. And Article 3 of the Constitution breaks down the judicial branch. So it establishes what this branch is, what the Supreme Court is, and lower federal courts, what their authority is, and defines their powers, jurisdiction, and their limitations. In Section 1, Clause 1, it talks about the creation of the Supreme Court. So judicial power is vested in one Supreme Court appointed by the president, and the lower courts are all established by Congress. This means that while the Constitution mandates the existence of the Supreme Court, it gives Congress the authority to manage all of the lower federal courts. Again, we're balancing power. We want to make sure that one person can't make all these decisions. And examples of your lower federal courts would be your district courts and your courts of appeals. In Clause 2 talks about the lifetime tenure for judges. Federal judges serve for life unless they resign, retire, or are impeached and removed, which I think is such a huge oversight for the founding fathers who were so careful and so diligent about making sure that power couldn't be consolidated. Why you would give someone a lifetime appointment is mind-boggling to me. Now, this is designed to protect what is presumed to be judicial independence by preventing political influence over judges. However, we know now that judges are very heavily politically influenced and by no means remain neutral. And just like everybody else, term limits for everyone. I think one of the major failings of the Constitution that has not been changed and should be is term limits for everyone. People in Congress should have term limits. Keep the term limits for the president, and judges should have years of service limits as well. Judges' compensation is covered in Clause 3. They receive a salary that cannot be reduced during their time in office, so it stays the same or can be increased during their tenure. This, again, ensures that the judicial branch remains free from political pressure. So say the president can't look at the Supreme Court and say, hey, if you don't do this for me, I'm going to cut your salary. But however, the Snyder decision last summer grants federal judges, including the Supreme Court, the ability to accept bribes and gratuities. So now we've removed this kind of freedom from political and financial pressure, and we've now implemented that into our system, which is pretty terrifying. In Section 2, Clause 1 talks about the type of cases federal courts can hear. So the Supreme Court and lower federal courts have the authority over these type of cases: constitutional issues, federal laws, treaties, disputes involving ambassadors and public ministers, admiralty and maritime cases, disputes where the U.S. government is one of the parties, so if someone sues the U.S. government, disputes between two or more states. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Louisiana sue New York over that the doctor in New York that prescribed abortion medication, even though he did it legally. Lawsuits between citizens in a different state, lawsuits between a state and a foreign government. So this clause defines the scope of federal judicial power and ensures that certain cases are handled at a federal level rather than by state courts. Clause 2 talks about the Supreme Court's original and appellate jurisdiction. So their original jurisdiction is ambassadors, public ministers, consuls, and disputes between states. And original jurisdiction just means they are the only court that can oversee these. Like, these cases go directly to the Supreme Court. Only the Supreme Court can make this decision. Appellate jurisdiction is when lower federal courts can appeal to the Supreme Court, and state courts, especially if constitutional issues are involved, can also appeal to the state court. And Congress can regulate and limit appellate jurisdiction. They can basically decide what type of appeals the Supreme Court is allowed to hear. Clause 3 is the right to a trial by jury. All criminal trials, except impeachment trials, must be decided by a jury. And again, impeachment trials do not cover criminal charges. They can only remove someone from an office, which is why an impeachment trial does not have to have a jury. The trials must be held within the state where the crime was committed, and this protects individuals from unfair trials by ensuring local juries and very public trials. Section 3 talks about treason and its punishment. Treason is the only crime that is explicitly defined in the Constitution. And a person can be convicted of treason only if they levy war against the United States or give aid, comfort to the enemies of the United States. 2 witnesses must testify to the act of treason, or the accused must confess in open court. This prevents political abuse of treason charges and ensures that false accusations cannot be used against political opponents. Again, in Europe, this was extremely common under monarchs. Accuse your competitor or your rival of treason, have them hanged or beheaded, and then you no longer have that competition. In Clause 2 talks about the punishment for treason. There's only 2 punishments for a conviction of treason. One is life imprisonment, which is the most commonly used, and the death penalty, which is rarely used. There's a no corruption of blood rule covered in the Constitution as the punishment for treason. This means that the government cannot punish the family of a person convicted of treason or seize their property beyond the person's lifetime. Again, this prevents abuse seen in Europe monarchies where treason would also extend to family members. Entire family members could be murdered and all of their property and titles and wealth could be taken. And now we come into Article 4. So Article 4 establishes the framework for how states interact with each other and how they interact with the federal government. Because while states have rights and responsibilities and obligations, they also have limitations, especially when it comes to protecting individual rights. So Section 1, Clause 1, each state must recognize and respect the laws, public records, and judicial rulings of other states. This is an interesting constitutional foundation because this means that a marriage or divorce granted in one state must be recognized in all the others. Legal contracts such as wills and court judgments must be honored across state lines. So this has huge implications for how marriage was handled within the U.S., especially when interracial marriage was illegal as well as same-sex marriage because, and this is the original Constitution, this is not an amendment, marriage is specifically protected. So if the state of New York honors same-sex marriage, that has to stand in all of the other states according to the Constitution. This written specific designation by the Founding Fathers played a huge role in the Loving versus Virginia 1967 case that said states must recognize interracial marriages, and Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015 that states must recognize same-sex marriage. This should never have been up for debate because this is inherently protected within the Constitution. And it was to prevent legal inconsistencies between states and ensure that citizens moving between states retain their legal rights. You can't say that all are equally protected under the law when your rights change based on what state you're in. Thankfully, because of how clear the Constitution is on this, it makes these cases a lot more airtight to being overturned because it's so explicitly written. Roe was passed largely on the premise of the right to privacy. And because it got overturned, that affects other rulings that were largely based on the right to privacy, which would include the Griswold versus Connecticut ruling, which was saying that you cannot make contraception illegal between married couples. That actually used to be a thing. It was illegal to use contraception as a married couple in Connecticut at the time. And the Lawrence versus Texas ruling, which means that you cannot make laws criminalizing consensual sexual acts between adults. So this was the right to privacy in the bedroom and a large step in protecting LGBT rights. You You can't criminalize someone for participating in something between two consensual adults. But all three of those rulings, Roe, Lawrence, and Griswold, were all based on the right to privacy. So overthrowing Roe definitely puts Griswold and Lawrence at risk, but Loving and Obergefell do have that original constitutional writing to support those decisions. In Article 4, Section 2, talks about the Privileges and Immunities Clause. This is that the citizens of one state must be treated equally when in another state. You cannot discriminate against residents of another state. The only exception here is that states are allowed to charge out-of-state residents higher college tuition, and they are also allowed to have residency requirements for hunting and fishing licenses. There's an extradition clause that talks about if a person is accused of a crime in one state, they must be returned to that state if they flee. This goes back into having a fair trial. It must happen where the crime occurred. And extradition in practice is simply like if someone commits a crime in Texas, they flee to California, Texas requests that California law enforcement return the suspect to them. Clause 3 is the Fugitive Slave Clause, which is now obsolete, but it's part of the original writing. It originally required that enslaved people who escaped to a free state must be returned to their owners. This was nullified by the 13th Amendment. Section 3 talks about the admission of a new state and federal territories. So Congress has the power to admit new states into the Union, and obviously early in our history, this was happening quite a lot as all 50 states were formed. And one of the few restrictions is that you cannot form a state within an existing state without the approval of both Congress and the state legislature, and states cannot merge or divide without federal state approval. For example, West Virginia became separated from Virginia in 1863 during the Civil War with federal approval. Clause 2, power over federal territories. Congress has authority over U.S. territories and federal lands, such as national parks, military bases, territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. So this would have included like the Louisiana Purchase. When it was first purchased, before any piece of it claimed statehood, they were controlled by the federal government. In Section 4, it's the guarantee of the Republican government and the protection of states. So the U.S. government must ensure that each state has a Republican form of government. This goes back to no individual state can have terms of royalty. They can't have their own monarchy or their own dictatorship. They have to follow our form of government, and the federal government ensures that. In Clause 2, the federal government must protect states from foreign invasion, and they can also help states put down domestic uprisings only if requested. It is outside of the purview of the federal government to intervene without that being specifically requested. This is seen historically in the Civil War when the southern states declared secession, the federal government intervened. And in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, I told you that alcohol plays a big role. President George Washington used federal troops to suppress an uprising in Pennsylvania. The Whiskey Rebellion was an armed uprising in western Pennsylvania against a federal tax on whiskey to raise revenue to replenish what was spent after the Revolutionary War. They were not having it. You're not going to tax their alcohol. We really need to push back more. I feel like we've kind of gotten a little soft with our government. We really need these guys were like, nope, you're not doing that. Like they tax the tea, they threw it in the harbor, tax the whiskey, they get an armed rebellion. And we also see this power exercised within the federal government. During the Civil Rights Movement, the federal government sent troops to enforce desegregation in states and cities that were unwilling to comply, such as Little Rock, Arkansas in the 1950s. All right, we are at the last article, and then we get to the interesting Bill of Rights and the amendments. Article 5 outlaws the process for amending the Constitution. Again, this is a living, breathing document, and it's supposed to reflect the people that it's built for, because Thomas Jefferson understood that technology changes, history changes, people changes, and those ruling documents should be changed and adapted over time, because this ensures a nice balance between flexibility and stability. So this proposed two methods of proposing amendments and two methods to ratify them. So there's the congressional proposal method, which is the most common. Congress proposes an amendment and with a 2/3 vote, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate. All 27 of the current amendments that we have been proposed by this method. But there is also the convention proposal method, which is really never used. It's 2/3 of the state legislators can call for a constitutional convention to propose an amendment. This was included to give states a way to propose an amendment, but has not been used. Then we move from proposal to ratification of an amendment. There are two methods of ratification. State legislatures, which means 3/4 or 38 states have to approve the amendment. This has been used for 26 of our 27 amendments. Or the state convention ratification method. 38 state conventions approve the amendment. This method was used only once for the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. They wanted to get that joker out of there. Congress decides which ratification method will be used when an amendment is proposed. Now, Article 5 originally had two limitations on amendments. One was slavery and taxes, which is obsolete today, but the Constitution originally banned any amendment that would ban or prohibit the slave trade or change direct taxing rules, such as income tax. The only other thing that there's limitation on is the equal representation in the Senate. No amendment can take away a state's equal representation in the Senate unless that state agrees to it, which why would they? So again, Article 5, why is this important? It allows that the Constitution can grow and it can breathe and it can change with the times, change with technologies. And it also is a requirement for supermajorities in both Congress and state legislators to ensure that amendment reflects the will of the large majority. So this prevents supermajorities from just taking over everything because it requires so much of a percentage of approval. It really reflects that this is the overall will of the people living in the country. And it allows for the Constitution to evolve without being completely rewritten. And since 1789, we have a total of 27 amendments that have been ratified, but there are others that failed to pass. One is the one that was in the news recently, which was the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was proposed in 1972. It was first introduced in 1923 by suffragist Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman. Soon after women got the right to vote, Alice Paul in particular knew that a woman's right to vote and women in general wasn't enough, that legal equality needed to be enshrined in the Constitution, and man, she could not have been more right. Women's rights are in such dire peril right now because women are not explicitly protected in the Constitution. The original wording of the ERA was that men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction, which you would think would be a really straightforward thing to pass, but it's been 100 years and we still have not passed it. The ERA was reintroduced in 1972, and by 1977, 35 out of the needed 38 states had ratified the amendment, but there was a lot of opposition, including from a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who was a conservative activist, of course she was, that led the Stop ERA movement, arguing that it would end protective laws for women like workplace protections, military draft exemptions, that it would legalize same-sex marriage, and weaken traditional gender roles. Of course. We can't protect our right to vote if it takes women out of the kitchen. Several states also rescinded their ratification, though that's not legally valid. They tried to do that also with the women's right to vote, and it's not legally valid once you've ratified it. Congress extended this deadline to 1982, but by 1982, the ERA failed. Decades later, it was brought back to push for the ERA, and Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia in 2020 finally ratified it, reaching the 38 states. However, people argue whether or not it counts at this point, which it should. It should be ratified and it should have been published by the archivist. But there was some argument between whether or not the expiration of 1982 was still applicable, even though Congress can remove that deadline, just as it has done for past amendments. And just for funsies, the states that rescinded their ratification, which is crazy because they don't want women to be equally protected, because again, if women are equally protected in the Constitution, it gives a huge foundation for the right to choose when it comes to our own bodies and medical decisions, and it would bolster the right to medical privacy. The 5 states that rescinded their ratification was Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, Tennessee, and South Dakota. No surprises there. And to be fair to the now former National Archivist, she simply refused to publish the ERA until she had a directive from Congress or the courts. Lawsuits have been filed and are ongoing, but the ERA is not recognized as valid. So remember, ladies, we are not protected in the Constitution. As of now, the only right that we have that is constitutionally protected is the right to vote. But thanks to Republicans and the SAVE Act, that is now on the chopping block as well, because the SAVE Act not only allows for the president to purge voter rolls and for voter rolls to be purged on very faulty information, as we saw last year, but it also makes it much harder for married women to be registered to vote, because your ID, your real ID, your tribal ID are not enough to establish citizenships. If you do not have a passport, you have to have an ID that matches your birth certificate, which of course for most married women does not match. Now we're going to jump into the Bill of Rights and the actual amendments. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments. These were proposed by James Madison, who was really trying to make an effort to assuage the fear of people who thought that the government would be so powerful that it would violate individual liberties. This was ratified on December 15th, 1791. The First Amendment is the freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. This protects the freedom of expression, religion, and the right to protest. And remember that freedom of religion also means freedom from religion. You do not have to practice a religion, and the government is not allowed to make a law about the establishment of religion, which is why Christian nationalism and fundamentalism, wanting to use the government to legislate their personal religious beliefs, is a direct violation of the First Amendment. The Second Amendment, we all know, the right to bear arms. It grants the right to own firearms, to resist. Now, this was written by, again, people who only knew about muskets and cannons, and it was also fairly recent to the British government trying to take away their arms so that the people could not defend themselves. The Third Amendment is the no quartering of soldiers, also a reflection of the Revolutionary War, where the British would force people to house soldiers within their homes, and this prevents the government from forcing people to do that. The Fourth Amendment is no unreasonable search and seizures. This requires a warrant for search and seizures. This originally only applied to the federal government. This did not really apply to the states until Mapp versus Ohio in 1961. And just a brief overview of that case, Dolry Mapp in 1957, who lived in Cleveland, Ohio, was suspected of harboring a fugitive, and police forced their way into her home without a warrant. They did not find the fugitive, but they did discover obscene materials, which were illegal at the time. Mapp was arrested and convicted for possessing these materials, even though police never executed a search warrant. So they were able to argue all the way to the Supreme Court that the evidence and the materials that they found could not be used in court because it was an invalid search and seizure. And that's how that law was able to extend to the states, not just the federal government. The Fifth Amendment covers the right of the accused. We've heard this in all the crime shows. I plead the Fifth. You have the right not to self-incriminate. There is no double jeopardy. Every citizen is required to have due process and restricts eminent domain, meaning that the government cannot seize your property without just compensation. So a key case for the Fifth Amendment, Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, is what led to what's called the Miranda rights. They're called Miranda because of that court case, that each person is supposed to get a description of their rights every time they are put in handcuffs. Should you not do that, the case may be thrown out. The Sixth Amendment is the right to a fair trial. This guarantees a speedy trial, an impartial jury, and legal representation. The Seventh Amendment is the right to a jury in civil cases, ensures a jury trial for lawsuits over $20, which again was quite a bit of money back then. The Eighth Amendment is no cruel or unusual punishment. This protects against excessive bail and or torture. In 1972, Furman versus Georgia challenged the death penalty under the Eighth Amendment, not just because the death penalty was considered cruel and unusual, but also because it very clearly disproportionately impacted minorities and the poor. The Ninth Amendment is unenumerated rights. Citizens have more rights beyond those listed in the Constitution. So it's a way of the Founding Fathers to say, hey, these are foundational, we're going to write these in here, but citizens also have more rights than we've included. The 10th Amendment is states' rights, powers not given to the federal government that belong to the states or people. Again, all of this was written with the intent to provide checks and balances in hopes that the government would not become so large and so powerful that it stripped people of individual rights. And this is the danger of the consolidation of power. So those amendments were really initially ratified very, very early in 1791. All of the following amendments happened from 1795 until the present. So the 11th Amendment in 1795 was lawsuits against states. This limits lawsuits against states by citizens of other states or countries. The 12th Amendment is the presidential election. So remember how in original elections, two people would run. Whoever got the most votes was the president, and whoever got the second most votes was the vice president, regardless of party. So this changed the Electoral College rules so that the president and vice president would run as a ticket, which is what we see now. And the reason that this changed was that the election of 1800 exposed some critical flaws. Because Thomas Jefferson, who was running as a Democratic Republican, and Aaron Burr, who was also running as a Democratic Republican, both ran and they tied. They both received 73 electoral votes, and the election was sent to the House of Representatives, where Federalists tried to block Jefferson. After 36 ballots, Jefferson finally won thanks to a key endorsement from Alexander Hamilton, who hated Burr, and yes, it's the same Burr that would later kill Alexander Hamilton. The 13th Amendment was the abolition of slavery. This outlawed slavery after the Civil War, but it's important to know that it allows for slavery if someone has committed a crime. If someone is in prison, they can actually be used as a workforce, which is becoming increasingly problematic with recent laws about arresting undocumented migrants, as well as unjustly delaying parole for minorities and the poor, who are very convenient workers when you don't have to pay them. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, which grants citizenship to former slaves, guarantees due process and equal rights. This was foundational for Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which was used to fight segregation. The 15th Amendment of 1870 granted voting rights for black men. Very important. It prohibited racial discrimination in voting for men. Later was weakened by Jim Crow laws, gerrymandering, and voter suppression. And the Progressive Era reforms happened from 1900 to 1933. The 16th Amendment of 1913 established income tax, which allows the federal government to collect, obviously, that income tax. The 17th Amendment, direct elections of senators. Senators were now elected by the people instead of the state legislatures. Up until that time, the state legislator would choose your senators. The 18th Amendment of 1919, the founding fathers would be so outraged, was prohibition. Banned alcohol and the sales and consumption of alcohol. They would have been furious. The disrespect. Obviously, this led to organized crime. This directly led to the founding of the Italian mafia and their strange connections with J. Edgar Hoover. I did a previous podcast very briefly called The Highway to Hell, which was a travel and true crime podcast where I cover the mafia, which prohibition just gave them the keys to the kingdom. The 19th Amendment of 1920 was the women's right to vote, guarantees voting rights regardless of gender, a long-fought battle, which I will eventually cover in a long-form podcast. The New Deal and the post-war changes from 1933 to 1967, the 20th Amendment of 1933 changed what's called the lame duck period. The lame duck period is basically the time between when a president's tenure hasn't ended yet, but his successor has already been chosen. So it moved presidential inauguration from March 4th to January 20th, basically shortening that lame duck period. The 21st Amendment of 1933 repealed prohibition. Yay! I really should have drank during this episode. I should have had a cocktail, but, I don't have my cocktail kit with me here in New Zealand. And in the 22nd Amendment in 1951, limited presidential terms. This is the one that limits 2 terms. This is in response to Franklin D. Roosevelt's 4 terms. 4. And the 2-term limit had been honored by precedent because George Washington served 2 and then walked away because he very much believed that one man shouldn't have power. He was so respected in the colonies, he could have been a king. But he had enough integrity that he didn't do that. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the only person who violated that, so they made it an official amendment. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment, D.C. gets electoral votes, which makes sense because they are citizens, even though it's not a state, so they were able to get some electoral votes. In 1964, the 24th Amendment issued a law against poll taxes, so especially in the South, in an effort to suppress the votes of poor white people as well as black people, there was a poll tax. You would have to show up and pay to vote. The 24th Amendment banned this. In 1967, the 25th Amendment was established. This was established to talk about who takes over if the president dies or is incapacitated or resigned. This was used later on in Nixon's resignation, and this is what determined that president, vice president, speaker of the House is the order of events if something should happen to both the president and the vice president. Modern voting and representation changes that took place in 1971 to 1992. The 26th Amendment of 1971, the voting age was lowered to 18. This changed the voting age from 21 to 18 due to the Vietnam War draft, which I agree with. If someone's old enough to go to war, they should be, in my opinion, old enough to vote, old enough to drink, old enough to smoke. Maybe that should be 21 across the board. But again, if you're going to send them to war, I think that they should be able to have a beer. That's just my opinion. The 27th Amendment of 1992, congressional pay raises. Congress can't give itself an immediate pay raise. This is where it takes effect the next term. So up until this point, Congress could vote to give themselves an immediate pay raise. That didn't change until 1992. This amendment, the 27th Amendment, was originally proposed in 1789. But it took 200 years to pass it. Why? Because who doesn't love voting on their own salary? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an overview of your U.S. Constitution and the rights and limitations and powers that it presents. I still have very high hopes that the 28th Amendment will protect women's rights equally, that people, regardless of gender, will be protected across the board, hopefully giving us a means by which to get the privacy of our medical records protected in the Constitution, as well as the rights to our own bodies. I hope that you learned something from this little lesson here and these stories and these anecdotes. I hope that you drank a great cocktail while listening to it. The Founding Fathers would be so proud. They would be so disappointed in the 19th Amendment taking away the right to drink. I mean, why would you do that? Thank you so much again to my Patreon supporters who are helping me fund my first campaign as well as funding the content that I create. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Flipping Tables.